Hello, my name is Jade Gosling, and I've chosen to do my presentation on one of the two systems-oriented theories, legitimacy theory, relating it to the Rothman's Edge of Legitimacy report. So what is legitimacy theory? Legitimacy theory is the assumption that in order for an organisation to operate and exist, it will act appropriately and in accordance with the social values and beliefs of the society in which it operates. In relation to accounting, legitimacy theory proposes that organisations disclose in the notes to their annual financial accounts any relevant social or environmental issues in relation to their day-to-day business activities. This is how many organisations act to remain legitimate in the eyes of the public or whoever it is that the organisation deems able to influence its legitimacy. This is because legitimacy theory is built around the assumption that there are social contracts between organisations and the public. An organisation that is acting responsibly and considering the rights of the wider public, not just its investors, is almost traded off for public acceptance and support of the organisation's operations. When a discrepancy is present between an organisation's actions and what society's expectations of the organisation are, a legitimacy gap is said to be present. These legitimacy gaps can threaten an organisation's image and reputation, and ultimately its existence as a legitimate member of the business community and society. There are several phases of institutional legitimacy theory, which encompasses the various organisational elements that represent the organisation in terms of its values, objectives, and how it goes about doing business. These elements are influenced by the various stakeholders within the institutional environment, such as government regulations and society as a whole. The two stakeholder groups that are considered the most influential in regards to the tobacco industry are the media, who reflect and influence stakeholder perceptions, as well as the government, who can use regulation to restrict resource flow. The level of acceptance, as well as any restrictions imposed by these stakeholders, will then impact which of the four phases of legitimacy the organisation will adopt and incorporate into its overall organisational strategy, including the voluntary social and environmental disclosures made in their annual financial statements. Identifying how organisations emit an appropriate degree of legitimacy to the public will allow them to gain acceptance and thus enabling them to appear both legitimate and meaningful. The tobacco industry offers an intriguing insight into legitimacy and how it is perceived in the real world. This industry clearly demonstrates the need for explanation and social disclosures due to the ongoing threats to this industry's legitimacy. Rothmans, a publicly listed Australian tobacco company, is currently experiencing legitimacy threats that have influenced the extent to which they have made voluntary disclosures in their annual financial statements. These threats include the adverse relationship between smoking and health, an increased government regulation, which in turn has elevated public hostility towards smoking and tobacco products, thus threatening the industry's income stream and long-term sustainability. This article highlights the main reasons that companies try to manage their legitimacy. The Rothman's Edge of Legitimacy is a longitudinal study aimed at identifying whether a correlation exists between the threats and changing conditions Rothman's tobacco company has experienced between 1956 and 1999 and the voluntary disclosures of social and environmental nature that it reported in its annual financial statements during this 43-year period. A positive correlation between the two would determine legitimacy theory to be a relevant factor for Rothmans when considering their voluntary disclosures. Within an organisation such as Rothmans, there are four phases of the legitimacy process that organisations are exposed to. These include establishing legitimacy, maintaining legitimacy, extending legitimacy, and defending legitimacy. Depending on which legitimacy phase an organisation is going through will determine their actions in regards to social and environmental disclosures. The first of these phases is establishing legitimacy. This is executed in the early stages of the organisation's development and involves promoting organisational effectiveness as well as meeting the needs of their target customers in terms of quality and desirability. Phase 2 is maintaining legitimacy. This involves protecting or maintaining the organisation's legitimacy once it has been established through organisational performance and ongoing emphasis placed on continuing to meet consumer needs, as well as mitigating negative changes to the organisation's legitimacy in the eyes of the public. This phase can prove particularly difficult when public expectations are consistently changing over time. The third phase is extending legitimacy. This impacts organisations when they experience a change in circumstances and are required to win the confidence and support of those who have become wary regarding the organisation and its operations in terms of legitimacy. The last phase of legitimacy is the defending phase, which involves organisations such as Rothmans providing a response when their organisation's legitimacy is challenged or threatened. There are 4 stages a company can use to defend its legitimacy, which include changing the organisation, changing public perceptions, manipulation, and misrepresentation. The Rothmans study identified several media influences that were of particular interest to the study that were thought to have a potential impact on the tobacco industry, which included general pro-tobacco articles, campaigns focusing on the links between health and smoking, as well as smoking while pregnant, and general anti-smoking campaigns. It is evident that Rothmans used several of these defence strategies when deciding which social and environmental disclosures they wished to report from one year to the next. For example, in 1958 was the first year in which Rothmans made disclosures relating to employees. Although this does not mark the inception of the Rothmans organisation, it could still be identified as a means of establishing legitimacy around a time where the organisation was becoming increasingly aware of the importance of being perceived as a legitimate company in the eyes of the public. In 1963, Rothmans' disclosures had more of a social connection, introducing a new section entitled Helping Australia's Progress, which focused on Rothmans' involvement with educational programs and their sponsorship of the 1962 Commonwealth Games. These disclosures indicate a degree of legitimacy maintenance, as these disclosures were made in the same financial year as the first report was released regarding the adverse effects smoking has on general health. Wind the clock forward another year to 1964, and Rothmans introduced a new section to their voluntary disclosures headed Smoking and Health, which claims that the adverse effects scientists and doctors are reporting regarding smoking being bad for one's health are inconclusive. This disclosure is a defence strategy aimed to change public perceptions in an attempt to mitigate Rothmans' perceived legitimacy. In 1972, Rothmans utilised another legitimacy defence strategy, this time using manipulation, in order to draw attention away from undesirable issues that were a cause for concern. 1972 was the year in which compulsory health warnings were introduced to tobacco products. Interestingly enough, Rothmans' voluntary disclosures this year shifted the focus to the various foundations that Rothmans had established as a way of diverting public attention to Rothmans' more positive relations. This was an attempt to reassure the public that they were still operating in a legitimate manner. Later in 1995 marked the year of Rothmans' last social disclosure, which was due to the strong anti-smoking message emphasised by the health risks involved with smoking. Rothmans again implemented defence strategies by ceasing to defend these allegations and instead turning their efforts to changing public perceptions through highlighting their positive engagement in various community areas, implying a favourable and legitimate standpoint without actually having to change the way in which they operated. As if admitting defeat, Rothmans had now given up trying to defend their claims of legitimacy to the negative relationship smoking had on people's health, and therefore discontinued their involvement in charities as well as reporting on it. Further quantitative research carried out on Rothmans and their disclosures resulted in conflicting results in terms of reflecting their defence strategies, and indicated more strongly towards considering an additional phase to the original 4 phases of legitimacy theory. This additional phase is loss, indicating the possibility of organisations losing legitimacy over a period of time, which they come to accept and thus cease defending the organisation's legitimacy. This scenario has the potential to eventually result in disestablishment if the legitimacy gap proves to have grown too large and public acceptance of the organisation and what it stands for is widely rejected. In conclusion, the Rothman study weighed up both qualitative and quantitative findings and concluded that there was weight to the hypothesis of legitimacy theory being a main contributing factor motivating Rothman's voluntary and social disclosures over the period examined, indicating that these disclosures were more than likely a strategy that Rothmans used to counteract the potential threats to their organisation's legitimacy that arose due to the negative and ongoing smoking and health debates that are still predominant to this very day.